Thank you for joining us today for the first URI violence prevention webinar. It is wonderful to have you all here joining us. Such an important topic at such an important time. We want to start, if we could ask people, thank you, Genoveva, to put your location. Where are you checking in from today? And also, if you can let us know, what is your affiliation with URI? Are you a CC member, an individual member, maybe trustee or staff? Maybe you're in from a partner organization of URI, or perhaps no affiliation with URI. We just want to know, like, who are you calling, where are you coming in from, and what kind of participant, URI participant family member you are. It's so wonderful to have such a grand, global, diverse family at URI, and it's always so wonderful to see everybody and where they're checking in from. So thank you for doing that, and love to see that. We have an individual member joining us today. Thank you. A couple of individual members. That's so wonderful to see. Really happy to see that, you guys. So thank you for joining us. That was the first sort of thing. We are recording, so if anyone, please note that we're recording, and that's going to be for the duration of the webinar. I'm going to share my screen here, and hope that I've got this set up properly. And you're going to see the end of the slideshow first, and then because I didn't have it prepared properly, but then we'll jump straight into our activity, if that's okay. Okay. And I need to do slideshow. All right. So today's presentation, the conversation that we came here to have, is on rethinking how we view violence. And I'm Karen Volker. I'm the Director of Partnership and Violence Prevention. And it's really wonderful to be able to spend this time with you. And thank you for your interest in this presentation. So let me see, I just want to make sure that that it's working properly. So in order to, I have a slight problem myself. Okay, that's okay. The Zoom screen, does anybody, let me see if I can just get rid of this bar. There we go. Okay. Sorry, everybody. All right, now I think I'm ready. Here at URI, we have three main purposes, and I'm sure that you're all very familiar with those purposes, but let's just talk about it, because we're going to set this webinar in the context of URI's three purposes. So the first, and one, we say them in this order, but the purpose number one, promote daily and during interfaith cooperation, and during daily interfaith cooperation. The second is to end religiously motivated violence. And the third is to create cultures of peace, justice, and healing. And this presentation is focused on purpose area 2, ending religiously motivated violence. But I do want to note that we are focused as faith leaders and actors on reducing all kinds of violence. We believe at URI that our membership, whether you're an individual member, a member of a CC, staff, trustee, we all carry around with us the power and the potential to interrupt and stop violence and to change norms related to violence. And so that's what we are hoping to inspire, and that's the conversation we want to have today. So the health approach to interrupting and stopping violence was created by Dr. Gary Slutkin, who is the founder of Cure Violence Global. He did this in about 2000, and I worked at Cure Violence for 10 years prior to this. And my job at Cure Violence was adapting the approach to other types of violence in other social and cultural contexts. So that's the experience that I bring with me here to URI. So let me tell you first a little bit about the Cure Violence's work and why we think it's so relevant and important, and then how it applies and what exactly the health approach is. So As I mentioned, part of my role at URI was to work on adaptations of the approach. And you can see that while they're best known for the work that they did in the United States, but they also have done work in, throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, in South Africa, near outside of Cape Town. They did a training in Nigeria previously. They had a 5-year program in Iraq. We had a couple of different programs in Syria, and we had a program at a youth detention center in England. So these are some of the examples of their partners that they've had around the world. And that's this approach, and we're going to talk about this in a second. Sorry. This approach, which has been going on since 2000, is now being replicated by lots of different kinds of organizations called different things. And but it's all based on the principles of the health approach. So I want to point out, these are different media. I think Larissa is going to put into the chat the link to the movie The Interrupters if anybody wants to see it, if you haven't already seen it. But I want to talk about the middle book, which is The Contagion of Violence. This is a workshop that was held by the Institute of Medicine in 2013. And this book is the summary of all of the studies that were presented at that workshop. It was a 2-day workshop with, I don't know, maybe 50 different scientists. There were neuroscientists, sociologists, anthropologists, who all did their own research on the contagion of violence. So the many different ways in which violence is contagious. And this is the first, I think, large event that really focused on the contagion, this phenomenon of the contagion of violence. And so if you're interested, this workshop can be downloaded from the Institute of Medicine website. I think if you just type in Contagion of Violence, Institute of Medicine, it's the first link. And it's a free download if you're interested. I always joke around, so if you can't sleep at night, you want to read these studies, you can do that there. So, I'm going to skip that one. We already saw that. So the health approach has been proven effective through a number of different studies and evaluations that have been done over the 20 years that Cure Violence Global has been doing it. This is just an example of the model, which is mostly focused on interrupting and stopping violence in the context of community violence. Some people like to use the term gang violence. And this was their first program internationally, which was in, I guess Iraq was the first, but the first one in Latin America, which was in San Pedro Sula in Honduras. And you can see where they had their interventions, the communities. And I want to take a second to say, this approach, the health approach, by its very nature is very localized. So you don't do a whole city, you do a neighborhood within a city. Right? You certainly don't do a region or a country like with this approach. It's very localized, which is another reason why I think it's so perfect really for URI and our global network, where people are very spread out and have local influence. This is why I think that this can really be applied in the URI context. So these are just some examples of the kinds of reductions in shootings and killings that you get. And I want to emphasize here that although the focus of the program is on interrupting and stopping violence, there are many other benefits when you use the health approach because of the sort of the holistic nature of the approach. So there are others, I don't have it in this deck for some reason, but there are a lot of other benefits to the program, such as people like going back to school or getting training or help with resume writings or getting jobs or other things because of the way in which the program looks at the whole individual and doesn't just sort of, it focuses, yes, on reducing shootings and killings, but the approach yields a lot of other benefits. So we consider that Cure Violence Global and through the Institute of Medicine and the World Health Organization that violence is an epidemic health problem. And I think we see this today, how much violence is spreading around the world. And if you think about it as an epidemic health problem, well, then it's logical to think that it can be treated with the health approach, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today. What is this health approach? So The core of the health approach is to consider that violence is a behavior. So it's a behavior that can be prevented and which spreads like a contagious disease. Now, I don't like to say the word disease because the people get hung up on that and then they start debating whether or not it's a disease. That's irrelevant. What is relevant here is that it spreads in a contagious manner, right? That violence begets violence, right? So I want to take off the table any conversation about whether it is or isn't a disease, and that's just a distraction as far as I'm concerned, right? So the really important part here is that if you look at violence as a behavior, it's about a bad behavior, not about bad people. And we know a lot about how behaviors can be changed, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So if it's a behavior that can be prevented, then we should be trying to prevent that behavior, right? And if it spreads, it's important to stop the first instance of violence because violence begets more violence. So waiting for violence to happen and then doing something to help the victims, which of course, if violence has happened, we do want to help the victims, but we really want to stop the violence from happening in the first place. So many studies, as I pointed out earlier in the Contagion of Violence workshop, have demonstrated the contagious nature of violence. This is these are some of the things that are in that workshop study that were presented at that workshop. So there's a study that was presented that shows that child abuse victims have 30% grow up to become abusers themselves, whether they become bullies as young people or abuse their own children later in life. It has an impact, and we're going to see in a minute on the brain that really is invisible, right? Chronic exposure to violence is associated with more. So if you have a chronic exposure, then you are more likely to become a perpetrator of violence, as opposed to low or no or moderate exposure to violence. So imagine people who live in conflict zones who are always exposed to violence for their entire youth. And we can think of several examples of that right now. Those people are growing up with a greater chance of themselves accepting violence and perpetrating violence. And so it's really important for us to recognize this. And it's not a judgment about those people. It's almost a cry for help, right? So it's really about how do we help these people who have this greater propensity to do violence and help them not to do the violence, right? And then there was even a study that showed that in the context of the post-World War II period, World War I and World War II, they did a study, and it showed that in countries where they were where the country was participant in the violence, the combat nations, that there was a much bigger increase in violence among combat nations than of non-combat nations. And in there was a decrease in violence, greater decrease in violence in non-combat nations, and no change. So you can see the slide, the graph on the bottom. And then if you like this kind of stuff, there's a lot more studies and a lot more interesting details about the ways in which violence is contagious in that book that I mentioned. So there's lots of ways that people get exposed to violence, right? It can come through the community. You can hear it or read it or see it through media, television, movies, video games, what have you. You can experience it in the home. You can experience it at school. And there's state-sanctioned violence, right, that we're all familiar with. So an individual is susceptible to violence, and they're basically, it's all around them. So the work that URI does, creating cultures of peace, justice, and healing, is so important in terms of building resilience in our communities and is a very important part of violence prevention. So I wanted to put this also in that context. There's the immediate interruption of violence when something's about to happen or happening and you can stop it from happening. But unfortunately, in many of the communities where our members live and work, there's violence around them and it's happening all over. So all of the work that we do through all 14 action areas is so important to creating resilient communities, also including to resilience to violence. So resilience in many ways. So it can transmit, violence can transmit across syndromes. So there's been studies that show that where you have community violence, you have a greater increase in risk for becoming a P, perpetrator of violence, V, victim of violence, or O, observer of violence. And so when you have community violence, all of those go up for community violence. There's studies that show that if you live in a place or experience and witness community violence on a regular basis, that you have a greater propensity to allow yourself to become a victim of violence at home, like family violence, and observer. And then you have also an increased risk of suicide, both. So I don't know why. I think P and V is kind of funny on that one. Sorry, it's maybe an English language thing. I'm not sure, but just anyway, it has an increased risk of suicide. We'll leave it at that. So we talk about it being contagious across syndromes. This is a medical term. A syndrome is like when you have a disease, you have different types of that disease. So if you can, in this case, if you think of violence as a disease, it shows up in lots of different ways. So one of those ways is the way that we focus on in terms of our purpose statement, religiously motivated violence. But it's related to all these other kinds of violence, right? Including violent extremism, family violence, child violence, suicide, mass shootings, community violence, wars, conflict, etc. So violence is a contagion, and it shows up in population in different ways, in the same way that diseases show up. So there's clustering, means that it comes together in certain places, right? It happens in certain places. And if you look at a map, violence isn't spread out evenly everywhere. It's clustered in very specific places. It has spread, right? That's one of the signs of contagion, and it's transmitted from one person to another person. So these are some of the studies that, this is ways to visualize this. So on the top left, you have violence clustering like a disease. So the image on the left is cholera. I can't remember where. I want to say it was in Uganda, but I'm not 100% sure. Cholera someplace, and then violence in the city of Chicago. And when these are blown up, you can see that it's clustering in very specific places. It's not everywhere. It spreads. So the curve on the right, to a scientist, to an epidemiologist, the influenza curve and the violence curve look very similar. It's kind of, when they look at curves, they're like, oh, wow, that reminds me of an epidemic, right? And then the third one is through social, transmits through social exposure, modeling social learning and norms, the way behaviors are usually transmitted, right? So if you're thinking about like a gastrointestinal disease, you would think about the disease coming in through the mouth, and then like it would be manifesting itself in the stomach, and then you have you might throw up or something like that, right? But with violence, the transmission happens through observing or witnessing or experiencing that violence, and it affects many different parts of the brain. And some of the most fascinating studies in the Contagion of Violence workshop summary are the ones that were written by neuroscientists. And in particular, the studies that have been done on the impact on children who are exposed to violence and how that shows up later in their lives in different ways, depending on when that exposure happened and how much exposure they had. So that means a transition it's happening in the brain, and they process it in the brain, and then it comes out. So this is meant to show how it is like a disease in the way of means of transmission. But there are, of course, modulating factors, right? So the age at which you are exposed is important, whether or not you have prior immunity. So this is where our building resilient communities comes in and is so important, right? The kind of exposure, how much exposure, and the context in which that exposure happened. These are all important modulating factors that can be taken into consideration. Not everybody who's exposed to violence becomes violent, right? So it's important to keep doing all the things that we do as a network, and also try to prevent violence more directly. One of the things I want to point out here that I think is important for a lot of people to understand is the pain center of the brain is affected. And the way in which they talked about it the most was the connection with social exclusion. So there's a study that shows that social exclusion registers in the pain center of the brain. So I think this is so important because a lot of times what people say is that the reason they went to violence or joined a violent group is because they wanted to belong to something. Or people who carry out mass shootings often feel excluded, like they're alone and they feel excluded from their communities or from their friends. And so it's a real pain that people are feeling in their heads when they're being excluded. And so it's real. It's not imagined, it's important. So again, all of the things that we do that are inclusive and that encourage people to become part of groups and reach out to people are very important and related to this whole problem of violence and violence prevention. So what do we know about how behaviors or violence is transmitted? So there's social learning, there's copying. I love the picture on the left, the little boy walking with his hands behind his back. He doesn't know why he's walking that way. He's just doing it because that's what the two bigger people are doing, right? Then there's the one on the right where you look at social norms, and you've seen this, we probably all experienced this as youth. People get angry at each other, they challenge each other to a fight, they're going to meet each other in the schoolyard, and there's going to be a fight. Now, if any one of those kids who had influence with either of the two that are going to fight had stepped up and said, I don't think you should fight, maybe there would have been a different outcome, right? But if they're encouraging the fight, there's a greater chance that violence is going to happen, that fight is going to happen after school. Social norms are extremely important. So in behavior, what we know is that up until the age of 10 or 12, violence is, behaviors are mostly gained through copy and imitation. So that's what we see on the left. After the age of 10 or 12, like adolescence, peer pressure becomes much more important. And what you think other people expect you to do becomes really the most important factor in determining your behavior. And so being really aware of what peers are thinking and really aware of what norms are in a community, what those are saying about violence is extremely important. And we're going to talk about norms a lot, and we're going to talk about who is the right credible messenger, because it's important. They listen to people that they know and trust. So they don't just listen to everybody or anybody, right? Again, I think this is why URI is so important for this because we have a global network of interfaith community activists who have influence in their communities and can use this influence to change norms related to violence, and perhaps in some cases to interrupt and stop violence. So the other part about transmission is neurological effects, and then we talked about the modulating factors. So fortunately, we know a lot about stopping epidemics. The World Health Organization has been doing this for a long time. And I didn't mention it, but Dr. Gary Sletkin is an epidemiologist who used to work for the World Health Organization. And he worked in the unit that designed interventions for interrupting and stopping the spread of contagious diseases. And so that is what he brought with him when he left the World Health Organization and he created Cure Violence. It brings this, I think decades of experience at World Health Organization talking about interrupting and transmitting the spread of diseases. So what are the three main parts of stopping epidemics? You interrupt transmission, prevent future spread, and you change group norms. So imagine this in the context of, let's just say malaria. So you want to interrupt transmission, bed nets, right? Prevent future spread. Maybe it's about killing the mosquitoes or something like that. And then you have changing group norms. Everybody gets used to using those protective measures. There's lots of other better examples. I'm not an epidemiologist. So, but let's talk about how this applies. Let's first talk about the public health methods. What do these methods include, and why is it so relevant for us? So it's important because it detects events early. So you're trying to find when something might happen and prevent it from happening, trying to prevent the spread of it if it already happens. You're working with the community in ways that are acceptable to them. This is what epidemiologists have been doing for decades. You really have to reach the people who are hardest to reach. So imagine if you're working on very sensitive things like HIV/AIDS, and you're trying to reach, let's say, sex workers, and you have to like reach those people. They're hard to reach. We maybe can't go in there, but we can find the people who they would listen to, who can talk to them about changing their behavior in terms of protecting themselves, etc. So it focuses, health methods focus on changing behaviors, focuses on changing norms, and most of all, it's very focused on those people who are highest risk for getting that disease or doing the violence in our case, right? So it's a very sharp focus. A lot of organizations, and I spent a decade, no, 2 decades in the State Department, and most of my job was coordinating foreign assistance programs. And we focused on, like, I don't know, maybe the high risk individuals. And often the high risk individuals, 90% of them are not going to do violence. It's really the top 10% of the 90% that of the people that we think are high risk are the ones that we really need to focus in on and stop them from doing the violence. Part of this is because there's leaders and there's followers. So if you're focused on the leaders, you can prevent the followers. The followers wouldn't do it unless the leaders did it, right? So you can really focus in on who you need to reach, and you don't have to reach everyone. That doesn't mean that all of the work that URI does to reach community-wide and build resilience isn't important. It is important. But for violence prevention work, we really want to focus in on those that are at highest risk for doing the violence and try to get them to change their behavior. And we'll talk about how to do that. So the 3 components of a health approach to violence interruption mirror the 3 components of the approach that the World Health Organization uses to interrupt and stop the spread of an epidemic, right? So detect and interrupt, find out or figure out or be aware and watching for when violence might happen and try to prevent it from happening. Change the behavior of the highest risk, and I should underline that 3 times, highest risk, and so that they don't do violence, right? And change the norms that support that violence as something that's normal and acceptable in that community context, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So we're gonna now we're gonna break it down. So what does it mean, detect and interrupt? We have to think about, where is the violence happening and how can it be interrupted, right? So it's not something that you do anywhere and everywhere. That's not important. You focus in on where you have the biggest problem with violence, and then how can it be interrupted? To do that, you have to really study and figure out who's doing it and try to prevent the transmission. So, sorry, I forgot about these. So the criteria for interrupting the violence are people who are from inside the same group, right? So whatever that group might be, someone from their own group needs to be trying to talk to them and get them not to do violence or change their thinking. Sometimes all you're trying to do is buy a day or buy an hour, right? You're trying to buy time because maybe they're very heated in their head. Another thing I didn't tell you about in the brain, in the neuroscience related to this, is that when people are in fight or flight mode, that's when you've been suddenly shocked and you all of a sudden you have to do something and you either fight or you run away, right? Fight or flight mode, that your prefrontal cortex disengages. And literally the brainstem takes over because you're in fight or flight mode. And you don't know what you're doing. You've probably heard of situations where people say, I didn't know what I was doing. And there are times when people say, I didn't do that. I don't remember doing that. They may be telling the truth. if they're like so disengaged from their prefrontal cortex, which is the part that connects all of the rest, all the parts of the brain. So I don't know why I said that at this point in time, but maybe it just occurred to me it was so important. But so they have to come from the same group. They only listen to people that they trust. So when they're in a fight or flight mode, a stranger's not going to be able to reach them, right? It has to be someone who they already know and already trust, who's trying to reach them and get them to change their behavior, who's getting them to like take a beat, wait a minute, maybe wait an hour. And by then, maybe they've cooled off and their prefrontal cortex has re-engaged. And I'm sorry, Maria, for the medical terminology. And they're able to like think differently, right? So buying that time can be a very important part of preventing violence from happening. They're also in a more rational frame of mind. So you might be able to talk them into some other approach rather than violence, right? Or non-lethal. I mean, like, yeah, at this point, we're trying to save lives, right? So the criteria for an interrupter is someone who can perform that function. They have to be from inside the same group, have credibility and trust with the individual you're trying to reach. They have to themselves want to stop violence. So you can't go to someone at the last minute and try to convince them. They have to already have it in their heart that they themselves are tired of the violence and they want to stop violence, right? And we already mentioned trust and access and credibility. So a lot of people ask, well, how do you make someone do this? And it goes to the second of these points. They have to already be there. But the good news is I did this for 10 years at Cure Violence, and there are always people in those communities who really, they've had a change of heart. They may have participated in violence in the past, but for whatever reason, maybe something happened in their lives that made them see how bad the violence was impacting their family and their community. But they've themselves turned a corner and decided that they want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. They always exist. It sometimes takes a long time to find them, but they're there. And it might be that they aren't there initially and they get there through this interaction. And again, that might be where all of the other stuff that URI does is so important, right? So those are the criteria for interrupters. The way it's done, total transparency. You're not doing it secretly. You're not trying to hide anything. There's nothing to be found out. There's no betrayal. You can't be accused of betraying anybody. It's all very upfront, right? If you have the right interrupter. And then I guess a question that we should be asking ourselves, can our members, whether it's CC members or individual members, become violence interrupters? And the answer to that is really very specific, context specific, in the location where people are, with the kind of violence they want to interrupt, with the people who are doing the violence. Do any of these people who are part of URI have that influence? Are they able to use that influence to prevent violence? I don't know the answer to that question. You guys will know the answer to that question. But it's not important to me that our members are the ones who become violence interrupters. But it is important to me that our members understand the theory and can maybe think about who are the interrupters. They don't have to be members of our network. They may become members of our network, but they don't have to be members of our network. We just need to be thinking about who they are. If, as an individual member or a CC, we want to get involved in interrupting violence. So it's only for those that want that. It's not for everybody, right? That's extremely important. This is not something we're asking or anybody's asking everyone to do. This is for those people who are interested in understanding violence interruption and want to do more in this area. This is, we hope, some tools and ways of thinking about things that could be helpful. And only for those who want it and are interested in doing that. So I just put this here because I put it on almost every slide deck. I love this image. It just shows breaks up the PowerPoint a little bit. and shows the contagion of violence. The top left, the man is being yelled at work. He comes home and he's upset with his wife. I guess his glove has a hole in it or something, or a sock maybe. And then she's upset and she yells at the boy, and then the boy takes it out on the cat, right? So it's a transmission, the contagion of violence. So the second part of behavior, of the methodology, the approach, is to change behaviors. So with behavior change, you need to identify those who are at highest risk for doing violence. And again, different people do different, there's different kinds of violence happening. So it depends on what kind of violence you're focused on, that who are the highest risk for doing that kind of violence in that place, in that context, right? It's very localized, very context specific. And then you work on changing their behavior. In a normal cure violence health approach, you would have violence interrupters who are workers and who are trying to put out the fires, like on every 24 hours a day, they're like watching for violence to erupt and they're trying to prevent it from happening. But in the second part of that model, there's a group of people who they call outreach workers. In Latin America, I think that their programmers, they call them promotores de paz. But they're like, they might look or feel like mentors or social workers. They work more of a full-time job. They have a client list of people who are at highest risk for becoming violent. And they're looking at all the ways in which they might be influenced in their lives to do violence. And so that they would be looking at what people like to call push factors and pull factors, that things that make them more likely to do violence, and then trying to address those factors, right? This is again where the URI, other programs that our members do are so important, because we're often addressing many of those factors in the other programs that we do. And so it's connecting the dots between those at highest risk to do violence and the things that we maybe are offering through other channels, or we know of other organizations that offer, or the government, that could address those push factors and pull factors. The third part of this recognizes that violence happens in a context in which it's become normal. So imagine a situation where there's high levels of community violence, and it's expected that if something happens to somebody from one group, they're going to retaliate and do something to the other group, right? And if they don't, there's maybe a lot of peer pressure to do something. So we need to change those norms. And that can be done in a variety of ways, including public education, but it could be done through any sort of religious sermon or conversations that are happening between people within the same faith group. It could be in the schools, it could be public service announcements. It's really what makes sense in that local context for that changing norms in that context. And it could be a variety of norms that are all supporting violence. So you have to really understand what are the norms that support the violence, and then how do you change those norms? And I believe that faith leaders, spiritual leaders, traditional indigenous leaders are all in key positions to change norms related to violence. This is just an example of some of the public education that is put out by some of the cure violence sites in the United States. It's very context specific, obviously, but these kinds of things can be created and contextualized to whatever the situation is and used, and whether it's a flyer, a bumper sticker, a leaflet, a t-shirt, a hat, what have you, anything that makes sense in that local context. So this re-understanding of violence, it reduces inequity and promotes understanding between people, right? It takes it from a moralistic bad person sort of framework and puts it more in a scientific framework. And it's about a bad choice or about a bad behavior rather than about a bad person, which automatically then takes it out of the rule of law framework where most violent programs are focused. Let's lock them up. Let's use violence to, stop violence. and it puts it more in a compassionate framework of understanding and really focusing on it's not that bad person, it's a bad behavior, and we can change that behavior, right? So why is violence such a serious issue still? Well, clearly there's a lot of violence happening in the world. We can see that today, and that violence begets more violence, right? There's also the change in thinking. There's an old way of thinking about it and a new way of thinking about it. And the old way is using violence to stop violence. Well, you can see the false logic in that, right? It's moralistic judgments, but that's not reflecting the latest neurological research, neuroscience on thinking and decision making. It's not, it used to be or has been thinking about bad behaviors instead of about learned or copied or contagious behaviors, which can be unlearned, right? It can be, it looks at norms versus just thinking, oh, they're in gangs and therefore you can't do anything about it. You can do something about it. You don't have to assume that because someone's a member of a group that they're automatically going to do violence, right? And then we lock people up. Well, what does that do? It's harmful in a lot of ways. And then they come out and they maybe just go back to doing more violence, right? As opposed to preventing through changing behaviors and using influence. So this is adding a new way of approach. It's not saying that the other approaches are obsolete and don't need to happen. There's still a role to play for police and military. There's still a role to play for political and diplomatic negotiations. But if we add the public health approach, we think we can do a lot more to make communities safer. And this is, again, very much at the very hyper-local level and in very specific contexts. And what our team hopes to do is to be available if people have questions and want to explore this further, to think together with our members and with our cooperation circles about how this, talk about their specific context, how it can be, how can we look at it? How can we maybe design an intervention that would work in that context? So it's something that is highly contextualized, led from the ground up. So it's led from the members, and we're just here as a resource to help think things through. At least that's our hope. So when you think about identifying credible messengers, these are some of the things that you want to think about, right? You need them to be focused on preventing violence, right? And you need them to have some experience with the people who are doing the violence that gives them that credibility and trust, right? So they have prior ties, maybe they're related to somebody who had ties. Maybe it's not direct, right? In one case, I know it was actually a football coach in El Salvador who actually had MS-13 and 18th Street youth that he was able to reach from both sides. So that made him a credible messenger, right? So you really have to know the local context to know who's credible. It's not that we can tell you from here, like there's one specific type of person or maybe profession. It doesn't work like that. It's really contextualized at that hyper local level. But I believe that faith leaders and actors, indigenous leaders, traditional leaders are all well positioned to help identify who these people are. They know their communities best, and they have the ability to then help figure out who are the interrupters and how do we engage them. So in order to prevent violence, you have to understand the context in which it's happening. And I think Larissa is going to put these questions in the chat. So these are the kinds of things we need to ask ourselves. Where is it happening? When is it happening? Is it certain days of the week, certain times of day? Because you don't need to do whatever you're doing all the time if it's only happening on, let's say, Thursday and Friday nights. Or maybe it's only happening on specific holidays. Of course, there's work to do in between the holidays to put into place the interruption network, but you're focused on preventing violence at a very specific time. So only you at the local level know when is it happening and how you need to design that intervention. So maybe it's not something that's year round every day of the week. It might be very context specific to certain holidays that tend to provoke violence, right? We have to understand who exactly is doing it. Is it in retaliation for another event? What do we know about that other event? How do we prevent that retaliation? And what are there groups involved or just individuals? And then get to the main question of who is influential with the people? Who are the people who can reach the people that are doing the violence and have the ability to change their thinking about the acceptability of whatever that is they're planning, right? And then I've put into that we're gonna, I think if people are interested, we're thinking about putting you into a breakout group or a few breakout groups. And we're gonna look at some of these questions. Hello, welcome back, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. Several people did have to leave, unfortunately, but I'm glad that some of you are here. We'd like to take the next 20 minutes. We were scheduled for 90 minutes, so hopefully you can stay to have the conversation that I was hoping to have. And really just want to hear back the reflections from the different groups. So rather than call on people, I would love for a volunteer who wants to be the first to report on what was the general conversation in your group. So do we have a volunteer to report from a group? I have no way of knowing who was the recorder. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Layla.
I can maybe break the ice since I was somehow jumping the moderating role in my group, and it was very rich discussion. And the question that you shared really they were really inspiring and people shared a lot. So in my group, there was Salette, who unfortunately need to leave because of another meeting that she has. Ravi, Genoveva, Serena, and also we have Mohammed. So as you can imagine, we have quite rich group literally from all over the world, which I think help us to have very productive discussion. And Serena raised important question at the beginning. She was interesting how she can learn more about violence that is happening in her community, because she is not fully aware where it is happening, how it is happening, and we then shortly discuss about that. And then each of the colleagues share from their own context. So Mohammed shared from the Horn in Africa how they are facing with religiously based violence, but also he raised very important topic about climate change and violence as a result of the climate change that we sometimes forgot is quite important, and the war that is basically climate change war that is happening in Sahara region right now. So he shared about that. Then Ravi shared about domestic violence, violence against girls and women, and all this like hate speech and psychological violence that is happening in the context of Sri Lanka, where he is living in. So let's share about her experience with the indigenous community, minorities, people of color in Brazil who are facing a lot of violence, as we all heard from the media as well. And Genoveva also was feel very safe in our group to share some of her personal stories of institutional violence that happened to her family in Bulgaria because they were forced. Her mother was forced to change the religion. She was put in institution, and as a result of that, she developed some psychological issues. So we have, as I just shortly mentioned, we have very, very rich discussion, a lot of contribution from different parts of the world, a lot of personal hard stories, but I think it's really drag our attention that we can discuss about violence in different contexts, not to forget climate change, not to forget psychological violence, hate speech, and even though it is happening in different parts of the world, I'm sure we all can find a lot of in common. And there was a lot of comments how your presentation, Karen, was really useful in our work in terms that now we can rethink about all this violence and maybe start thinking how we can prevent it or understand where it is happening in order on the next time not to have discussion about all this violence that happened, but what we did in order to prevent some of these things from happening. So we have really long discussion, but to put it in few sentences, that was some of the main points.
Thank you so much, Layla. Thank you for that report from your group. It sounds like a very rich discussion and highlights the challenges that we face with so many kinds of violence showing up in our world, right? And so I think collectively, we just want to start an ongoing conversation about how can we address these different kinds of violence, where they're showing up and how they're showing up in our communities. Thank you for that. Do we have another volunteer to share what your group conversation was about? Thank you, Mahmoud. Oh, I'm so sorry, Cynthia.
No,
We'll come
it's
to you,
okay.
we'll come to you next. How's that?